Hi, I'm Daniel Levy. I co-direct the Middle East Task Force at the New America Foundation, a think tank in Washington, D.C. I'm also a senior fellow at the Century Foundation in New York, and in the past I've worked in the Israeli government as an official peace negotiator and in other capacities as advisor in the Prime Minister's office, to the Justice Minister at the time, and in think tanks in Israel and in unofficial Track 2 negotiations. And I'm here today with Aaron Miller. Aaron.
Yeah, hi, I'm Aaron David Miller. I'm a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm a former U.S. Middle East negotiator and advisor to a half a dozen secretaries of state on Arab-Israeli negotiations. I'm trying to get away from the Middle East now, writing a new book called Can America Have Another Great President? ? Daniel, we've seen a pretty big flap in the last week in relations between the United States and Israel, particularly in the relationship, perhaps, between the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the American President, Barack Obama. I'm just mulling it over right now. How bad a crisis do you think this really is?
Well, look, I think it can be blown out of proportions. I think thus far it's been very much kept at the level of rhetoric. We haven't seen, I don't think this comes close to what we saw in 91-92 when the first President Bush was in office. We had Yitzhak Shamir as the Israeli Prime Minister, and what was perceived as recalcitrance on his part, the part of the Israeli PM, was met with an actual sanction by the then president, with the withholding of certain amounts of loan guarantees. Obviously, this isn't the crisis of the mid-70s when the Ford administration announced a reassessment of their strategic policy vis-a-vis Israel. It's also not something particularly new in the context of Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Israeli Prime Minister. And for me, this is very reminiscent of Netanyahu's first term in office. He was Israeli Prime Minister from 96 to 99. At the time, then President Clinton found that Benjamin Netanyahu was, sounds familiar, holding back efforts to move forward the peace process. And that was occasionally communicated in public in no uncertain terms. Israelis don't like it when this happens. The Prime Minister is in an uncomfortable situation at home. Obviously, this spat is public. It's not something that's been kept under wraps. It's also perhaps a little different this time, I would say, and I'd be very keen to hear where you place it on the scale, Aaron. I think it's a little different this time because the language that we're hearing, the discourse that we're hearing from the American side is not just about the Israeli premier or Israeli policies being unhelpful to the peace process. In other words, settlements are unconstructive, we're trying to move forward peace. We're hearing that, but we're hearing something else as well. And what we're hearing is this is unhelpful to American interests. That America has concerns in the region that are impacted by how this looks and by how America does or doesn't do in addressing the Israeli-Palestinian situation. We're hearing that language, and we're hearing the language of how this impacts the bilateral relationship. And that's what takes this to a slightly different level, it would seem to me.
Yeah. You know, I'm familiar with both of the previous crises that you alluded to. I was
in a more first-hand capacity than me, I'm
sure.
I
was working, for Baker at the time of the 1991 crisis of vulnerabilities, and even more intimately familiar with the first incarnation of Netanyahu's prime minister in 96, 99. I think what separates both of those, however, from this is that the tensions in the relationship on the American side, under both Baker and then President Clinton, were set against the backdrop of a moment in which it was possible to actually envision an agreement. So, in a way, you had a strategy Baker used loan guarantees, denied them, frankly, and obviously allowed Shamir's successor, Rabin, to take advantage of them. There were tough patches, as you recall, with Netanyahu and Clinton, but we managed in both of those crises situations, quote unquote, to actually achieve something. Madrid Peace Conference in October of 91, and then two agreements which were placeholders, really. The Hebron Protocol in 97 and Y in 98. So I'm concerned, and have been from the beginning when this brouhaha kicked up, that while it's certainly not the worst crisis, I mean, you didn't even mention Suez, in which the Eisenhower administration in 56 actually threatened sanctions against the Brits, where you are now, and also against the Israelis. What concerns me about this, and
I didn't want to further muddy the waters of British-Israeli relations.
Right. It's not a good time.
Two passports I hold.
Right. That's right. Not a good time anyway to do that. In view of Dubai at all, but I'm a little concerned that there seems to be no one in charge on this on either side, and that fighting with the Israelis is an occupational reality. I mean, any serious American president or secretary fights with the Israelis, and to a lesser degree with the Arabs too. But the outcome of the fight, which makes it worthwhile, of course, is designed to achieve an objective. So, in terms of severity, which I think is an interesting point, it's not the most serious crisis, but I am beginning to think it's also not a bump in the road that is going to be easily mended. I remember, and this is the last point I want to make on this, in May of '89, when then Prime Minister Shamir came to Washington for his initial encounter with then President George H.W. Bush. And in that meeting, the relationship between these two was effectively ruined, because the president believed, rightly or wrongly, that the prime minister had misled him on the issue of settlements. So there is this notion of trust, and trust is extremely important. You know, there are at least three people in this administration who've seen the first Benjamin Netanyahu movie: Rahm Emanuel, Hillary Clinton, and of course Dennis Ross. The question is, I believe that the administration doesn't want to see this movie again, that you have a president fresh on the heels of one of the most consequential victories in American politics, on a par with Medicare, Medicaid in the 60s, maybe Social Security, who is emboldened, who believes in big things, and who may no longer be a transitional president, who may think he is a transformational one. And he's applying the same big idea approach to the domestic success to this one. And the question is whether or not that's wise. But over to you.
Well, I follow what you say and write on this very, very closely, Aaron, because I greatly respect your opinion. And hearing you say, maybe we're switching from transitional to transformational is interesting. I agree in part and disagree in part, and let me try and tease that out. First of all, you're right. The key actors, some of them in the Obama administration, have seen this movie before, and they've seen it with the same lead actor on the Israeli side. And you write in your book, The Much Too Promised Land, that the most important part of the Israel-US relationship, or influential, is the lobby of one, the Israeli prime minister of the day. Benjamin Netanyahu, and I'll just share my theory with you, didn't manage that well when he was prime minister first time around. My sense is that everyone expected, okay, he doesn't want to repeat what happened. He fell foul of the US administration. Israelis don't like it when that relationship is wobbly. He paid a political price, Mr. Netanyahu. His coalition collapsed and he lost an election. Not only because of US-Israel relations, but that was a significant piece of it. My expectation was he played this very differently. Part of what I think we've seen is that Netanyahu may have looked at this and said, there wasn't much I could do when Bill Clinton was president. The Israelis already loved him. But maybe I can keep Mr. Obama in a box. Maybe I can make sure that the Israelis will always relate to him differently. And I think there's been a quite concerted anti-Obama campaign in Israel. And I'm not at all sure that the Prime Minister wasn't part of it. In fact, I'm almost sure of the opposite. So he hasn't managed this well, and he is paying a domestic price. Where I'm thinking this is different is the following. In Madrid, convening a conference could be a success. During the 90s, making incremental progress on Oslo B and Oslo C and Oslo D agreements, like what was negotiated with Levy in 98, the Wye River Memorandum, Netanyahu, Clinton, Arafat, could be considered progress of a kind. It's 2010. The clock expired on Oslo in 99, over a decade ago. So my own take on this isn't something you can try and build confidence or work incrementally on. That transitioning is almost not an option. It's transformational or nothing on this question. And I tend to detect a strategy at play here from the Obama administration. Not one that's necessarily been thought through all the way, and one that they may have stumbled upon in the course of the last year plus. But I think that their feeling is you can't really get anywhere unless you can at least get a border. For me, it's an open question whether you can close the conflict, end the conflict, address all the issues. But you can't really do anything, I would argue, and I'm detecting an element of this in the Obama administration, without determining a border. And therefore, if I extrapolate back and see what we've gone through, I think you've taken the US-Israel conversation, and in many ways the conversation inside Israel, to a place where if you can't free settlements, if you can't do anything in East Jerusalem as an interim gesture, then I think the pivot to the argument that, therefore, the only way to not have these episodic crises, to not keep endangering the relationship, to move forward, is to go for a border. We won't, I don't think, have that articulated by the administration this week or next week, but I feel they are walking Benjamin Netanyahu down a corridor where the exit hatches are being shut on all sides, and eventually he may find himself in front of a quite binary choice with regards to a border.
You know, I very much agree, because it is my fundamental conviction, as you know, we've talked about this a lot, that a conflict-ending agreement on the core issues, Jerusalem, security, and refugees, and borders, if you're going to try to do the whole thing, you're going to fail. Because you have weak leaders, you have large gaps, and you have a regional environment, frankly, which we need to talk about, because, you know, we focused this week on the dysfunction that exists in Israeli politics. There's a 10,000-pound element in the room, which no one now wants to recognize, which is called the Palestinian Humpty, which is hugely important. Because if you, and this, I guess, is my point on borders, I think you're 100% right that the administration has realized also that a conflict-ending agreement is not possible, that borders is, in fact, their preferred strategy, because you can arguably get at settlements through the back door if you could define a credible border, June 67, with swaps, with mutually agreed modifications, and that they may be trying to create some measure of time and space by freezing the situation in Jerusalem in order to have that negotiation. But the key here, you talk about closing the hatchways. The problem with closing the hatchways, unless your objective literally is to sink the ship, is that it was possible to trap Shamir, because we were dealing with process. It was possible to trap Netanyahu in his first incarnation. Remember, Daniel, as you know, he's the first Likud prime minister ever to withdraw from West Bank territory after he said he wouldn't. The problem with trapping him, and I think the strategy is in fact designed to do that, you can't do it just by threatening pain. You have to create a set of incentives which promise gain. This is the same analogy by which they got Shamir to come to Madrid. You basically give him Assad. This is the way that Sadat and Kissinger and then Carter trapped Begin. Although I wonder who trapped whom, because Reagan gave the Sinai back to keep the West Bank, and it's been in Israeli hands ever since. So You've got to structure, because these are existential questions, you've got to structure, whoever the prime minister of Israel is, the kind of relationship that, yes, you're prepared to be tough, but you're also prepared to reassure. And my whole problem with this is that, back to your point, they haven't thought it all the way through. And since we're not just dealing with procedures, and you've got Iran, right, looming in the background, this great shadow, for which we don't have an answer, I might add, neither do the Israelis. I wonder if you can play this kind of politics. One final point, and I don't think we should rule it out. Is this about modifying the behavior, or even trapping this Israeli prime minister? Or is what's really going on here regime change? Having seen the first Netanyahu movie, could it be that the administration is prepared to sacrifice negotiations or even a process by day after day hammering Israel? Not sanctions, hammering Israel rhetorically, if, of course, Netanyahu doesn't give them the right answer, which they're waiting for, with a view toward just allowing nature, whatever that means, to take its course. My whole problem, my final point, is that the strategy here is very uncertain and unclear to me. And it's almost as if they've plunged ahead, much as they did in 2009, with a comprehensive freeze, including natural growth, asking the Saudis for partial normalization, and then trying to persuade the Palestinians to get back to the table. And they got 3 no's, which undermined our credibility as a great power. Having climbed up this tree now, they ain't got much of an alternative if Netanyahu chooses to fight them over Jerusalem.
It suggests to me, first of all, let me open a parenthetical. I think part of dealing with Iran is being a lot more sensible and realist about the nature of the threat posed by Iran. And I think that would be wise to introduce that more both into the American and especially into the Israeli discussion. And there are elements in the Israeli elite, including in the security establishment, even in the government, who are more sanguine about the nature of the threat posed. And of course, Defense Minister Barak in Washington recently said, much as we don't like them, they're not meshuganas, which is the Yiddish word for crazy people. I'll close that parenthetical. I'm cautious about giving Netanyahu the credit for having been the first ever liquid prime minister to have withdrawn on the West Bank. You're right, but one should also recognize what the withdrawal was. The withdrawal was a transfer of certain responsibilities to a limited Palestinian self-governing entity. This wasn't a transfer of sovereignty, and it wasn't a withdrawal of settlements, certainly. Regime change. Look, even if it was the policy, it wouldn't be articulated as such. We both know, and you remember better than me, that that's what was achieved by the Clinton folks with Netanyahu the first time round. And as you acknowledged right at the beginning of our conversation, we're in a very, very different political climate today because we're now in a presidency that has achieved a dramatic piece of social domestic legislative reform, something generational or even more than that. I think they want to present, or I think they'd be wise to present, let me put it like that, a clear choice in front of the Israeli Prime Minister, his coalition, the Israeli body politic, and the Israeli public. And I don't know if it's overgenerous to, in hindsight, say this is where they've been going from the beginning. Maybe it is. But I'd say that we're in an interesting place in late March 2010. We have an Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who, when he came into office, I think it would have been a fair bet to say, look, the last thing he wants is to find himself in a negotiation that is clearly driving on final status issues, including on border issues. He would have preferred to have focused on day-to-day confidence building, on what he termed economic peace, on anything but dealing with issues like borders. We would definitely have said that if he ever has to get into that conversation, for heaven's sake, Jerusalem can't be on the table. And yet we find ourselves today in a situation in which Netanyahu is the one calling for the negotiations. Because they basically said to him, look, if you want to do gradual confidence building, first of all, you have to stop eating the slice of pizza we're discussing, which means stop building settlements. He couldn't deliver on that. Now East Jerusalem has blown up in everyone's face. By the way, Netanyahu started that this time around or didn't start it, it may not have been his decision, but it started on the Israeli side with this new settlement construction. So you're now in a place where East Jerusalem is clearly on the table. So whether by default or by design, I think we find ourselves in a place today where it would not sound unreasonable at some stage in the near future to do something which we both now just said. Say we should be defining a border based on 67, 100% of the territory, land swaps to take into account development since 67. You're not going to withdraw the 500,000 Israelis that are on the other side of the green line. And I still sense that if that were on the table, I don't rule out Netanyahu making the right decision, but I certainly don't rule out the Israeli body politic coming together to make the right decision. I define the right decision, of course, as saying, yes, let's go for it. We need a two-state solution. One other thought on this, and then maybe we should go back to your point, and maybe you could elaborate on the broader regional situation that one faces. But I just want to relate to this incentives and disincentives. I think it's crucial that Israelis are convinced that the security assurances are there if and when they move forward towards actually doing two states. So I think there's a degree of reassurance that has taken place. Probably more needs to happen. But I also think that they have to appreciate that there is a price to maintaining the status quo. For me, the biggest disconnect there is you know as an Israeli leader that if you're going to actually end this thing, at least in terms of the border, at least getting this initial two-state dispensation, you know if you're going to do that, you're going to have an almighty political struggle with the settlers. Because after 40 years, the settlers, their sympathizers, the ideological ones, are everywhere in the Israeli system, everywhere in the Israeli body politic. You know it's going to be a huge fight. If the consequence for not having that fight is that nothing happens, if that's the incentive-disincentive structure, then you couldn't ever expect any progress. And one has to begin to address that. Clearly, you need to demonstrate to the Israelis there are benefits to be had, but there has to be some sense of a consequence in the absence of progress.
Right. But the problem here, and I think it gets back to the issue of what's on the table. The problem here is that the incentives and disincentives cannot be offered up just by the United States.
I agree.
And this is where we have a significant problem, in which discussion has to turn both to the regional situation as well as the rather sorry status of the dysfunctional Palestinian national movement. I couldn't imagine, and maybe crisis brings opportunity, variation of the Chinese saying, but I couldn't imagine on paper, if I were a human being from Mars or looking down on this situation, with no understanding of it, a worse time to be trying to get Israelis and Palestinians to make existential decisions. Now, in part because of the immediate situation. I mean, if you want to entice existential decisions out of the government of Israel on borders, on security, on refugees, and on Jerusalem, you need to come up with the quid and the quo, which cannot be provided just by America. And here we get to the issue of what I call the Palestinian Humpty Dumpty. How do you structure those incentives when, in fact, you have two discrete leaderships governing two discrete populations with two discrete sets of security services, with two discrete streams of funding, two discrete patrons, and worse, two discrete visions of what constitutes Palestinian nationalism? If I'm an Israeli prime minister, and I have no intention of writing a brief here, for the Israeli Ministry of Public Affairs, there isn't such a thing. But I wouldn't make concessions of any meaning unless I had a partner who not only controlled all the guns of Palestine, Daniel, but was prepared to silence them as well. That's the first problem that we have. Even if you could coax the prime minister into confidence builders that would freeze the situation in Jerusalem, let's assume you could. You've got that huge problem. And number two is the regional situation. I mean, between Hamas and Hezbollah, non-state actors and non-states, and Iran, you have a situation in which it's going to be extremely difficult to protect this process, hermetically seal it from very intrusive forces. And finally, you do have Iran. And again, I don't fear the nuclear exchange, precisely for Barak, because Barak is probably right. I mean, Netanyahu says we're not going to let Ahmadinejad do in 8 minutes what Hitler tried to do in 8 years. I don't fear that. Here's what I fear. I fear the fact that sanctions will not work. I fear the fact that diplomacy won't work because the Iranians aren't interested. I fear the fact that the reformists don't have the power to outrun the centrifuges, and that within 3 years, Iran, which is determined, like most states that are driven by a profound sense of entitlement and insecurity, North Korea, India, Pakistan, need I go on? They all acquire weapons. I fear the ultimate acquisition of the breakout capacity, and then what happens after that. So between the Palestinian Humpty Dumpty and the Iranian centrifuges, the question is whether or not you can induce Israel, just as a consequence of American pressure, without, and here's where I get to the key point, and you'll have to help me, without an Arab-Palestinian incentive that offsets the fears and anxieties that will run rampant. See, this can't be one-hand clapping, which is why the toughness that was required from Kissinger, Carter, and Baker was all compensated to a degree by Arabs. Sadat, Arafat in his first incarnation in Oslo, not much of a comforting figure, but Rabin worked with him. Even the prospects of a negotiation with Assad, I don't see how you offer up the regional anchor that is so critical to inducing the Israelis to make the deal in these circumstances.
Let me try and address those points, and they're all very powerful ones. On the Iranian side, I agree with you both in terms of your assessment of the reformist Green Movement, your assessment of where the urge is coming from Iran, an entitlement embedded in international agreements even, but also one embedded in Iranian culture. And I don't think the sanctions are going to work, she says. Where I go with that is one of two places. I think either one goes from a rather narrow focus of one's attempt to engage with Iran to a broader focus, but I would certainly not confidently state that there will be an Iranian willingness to get on board if that's what's on offer. And then the strategic conversation, of course, includes a discussion of Iranian acceptance of the Arab Peace Initiative, of any Israeli-Palestinian dispensation that's agreed, withdrawal of support for at least the violent element of the activities conducted by groups that do receive Iranian backing, etc. In the absence of that, and the other alternative, which goes right back to the Yitzhak Rabin logic of the early 90s, is reduce the attraction of making Israel a mainstay of the Iranian narrative. One of the things, this is a point made by many people, one of the reasons Iran time and time again focuses on Israel is because it has a resonance, it has an echo, it has an appeal. The Sunni Arab street The Muslim world isn't very attracted by the Waliyat Faqih, the Shia rule of jurisprudence government of Iran. The resistance narrative is attractive because there's something real out there. Palestinian dispossession, which hasn't been addressed, which Arab governments are complicit in, which America is, of course, very complicit in. If you can remove that thorn, and this was part of the Rabin logic, then you reduce the attraction of targeting Israel. So I'm not saying that that's an easy sell with Israelis, but there's plenty of Israelis who certainly see it. The Palestinian Humpty Dumpty. And here's where I draw my distinction, because I think that it's worth considering the immediate ask not being the dramatic end of conflict, end everything, deal with the big narratives, deal with the Jewish nature of the state, the creation of the refugee problem, etc. I would be much more focused on deoccupation as the goal. And practically speaking, I agree in terms of marketing it's not simple, but practically speaking, your demand and your need from the Palestinian side is less. I think we've approached the region wrong. I think one should have been trying to diffuse rather than encourage the Arab Cold War that's in play. It's difficult when Egypt, for instance, is a so-called moderate and pro-peace actor, but a sclerotic actor, and one that is very difficult to get anywhere with. We're not where we were in the past.
Right.
But we do have the Arab Peace Initiative. And my sense is that if there were a willingness to bring Hamas in, to work with the Syrians, to go for a comprehensive border arrangement, to root that in the Arab Peace Initiative, then you could still have some of these quid pro quos that you claim are missing. By the way, I think one needs to involve other international actors like the Europeans.
Right.
But specifically on the Palestinian Humpty Dumpty, the ask might have to be, Israel, this is a border that one needs to withdraw to in order to allow for the creation of a Palestinian state. You have legitimate concerns. Let's see how we can address your legitimate concerns. Let's separate the wheat from the chaff. If this is about your desire for security guarantees, so that there is not a security vacuum when you withdraw, and your need that there not be a governance vacuum, so that chaos does not produce a security threat, then let's walk through each of those concerns. Is NATO an answer? Perhaps.
Yeah,
Is some kind of high representative an answer to oversee Palestinian governance for a period of time? Bosnia, East Timor, we have examples. Perhaps if Hamas sign up for a long-term ceasefire alongside Fatah, ideally we put Fatah Hamas together. If we can't do that, do we sign off separately with Arab guarantors for Fatah, PLO on one side and Hamas on another? Let's drill down those issues. But first we have to know that those are the issues that concern you. Because right now it seems like it's actually territorial aggrandizement. It's actually trying to push further and further into the territories. It's taking more land. It's not being willing to confront the settlers. So let's address the real concerns, and let's make sure that what the real problem isn't that you're just not willing to leave. And
right.
I think there are answers to all of the above. There's no such thing as a total risk-free environment. A difficult sell to Israelis, but one has to create a moment of choice.
Well, there are
because the alternative is a horrible one.
Right. There are risks, and there is no risk-free environment. But you're way ahead of me now on security issues. I'm simply pointing out one inescapable fact. You can't even get the ball rolling until you would be able to persuade an Israeli interlocutor that a commitment to withdraw to June 67 lines with modifications and swaps would somehow create a unified Palestinian authority, one gun, one negotiating position, one authority that would give the Israelis what it is they want. And I might add, we're well beyond the sentimentality of peacemaking of the 90s. This is a business deal.
Absolutely.
And frankly, it's a business deal because if you look at the 79 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, what you see is no sentimentality, no idealism at all. This is a bargain for hard men and women. This is a deal for transformed hawks, not for doves. And that's why Netanyahu was an interesting character in all of this. Just like Begin was, like Sharon's unilateral disengagement, even Rabin, the breaker of bones, was the transformed hawk. What I just can't
and
get...
Livni is a transformed
right,
hawk as well.
Exactly. Right, but what I can't get my mind around is, in order to get the Arabs to sign up, in order to diffuse the Iranian propaganda, the master puppeteer, using Hamas and Hezbollah, using the resonance of the Palestine issue, you need not just a business deal on borders. And remember, Daniel, as you know, as well as I, better perhaps, Jerusalem is both an identity and a territorial issue. This is the flaw in the logic. You can't just deal with borders. And the Palestinians probably won't permit it. Again, I question, and this is why I'm concerned, I question whether or not, moments of choice notwithstanding, unpalatability of the status quo notwithstanding, trying and not succeeding, which is the mantra Bill Clinton gave us after the second briefing at Camp David before we went to the summit, when he said trying and failing is much better, guys, than not having tried at all. And I was very impressed and compelled by the slogan. But for the great power to try and fail carries a cost and consequence, particularly when the great power doesn't know what it's doing. And I have to tell you, I am not at all I voted for Barack Obama in large part because his election represented the validation of the system that I cared about. The Brits, the French, the Israelis could never have done what we did, which is to elevate a former member of a despised, at least in Michelle's case, formerly enslaved minority group, and elevate that man to the most powerful person on earth. But I don't know, frankly, whether or not they really do know what they're doing. Because the pieces of the puzzle that need to be addressed, and maybe they will over time, don't seem to me to be able to fall into place without a strategy that is grounded in the limitations of the moment. And I quite agree with you. I think it's a conundrum because the alternatives over time, as we both know, are pretty grim.
And I think what we've heard more of this week is that grim reality, unfortunately, doesn't end just for Israel or for the Palestinians. One of the things that brings me to this and motivates me is obviously what it means for Israel, what it means for applying Jewish values, what it means for applying universal values, because I think there's a structural logic and a structural dynamic to occupation, especially to one that's this entrenched and this untenable for those who are being occupied. But it's bad for America as well. And if I'm right, and if the structural logic means that things continue to deteriorate and get worse, and what we saw a year and a bit ago in Gaza, etc., and the extremism that this breeds on the Israeli side as well, and America is continuing to carry that can, that's very serious for the US. So how do you break that conundrum? And I'll just throw this one out, as I guess we're approaching the end of our conversation. If you can get a border, including in Jerusalem, I think you probably have to say new rules of the game for the old city. Not an ultimate closure on the old city, on the holy areas, but new rules of the game. You semi-leave that one aside. But the neighborhoods, the ones that are so in contention right now, that we've been spending so much the last 2 weeks talking about, that's part of the border dispensation. If that's enough to get either your unified Palestinian side or both sides of the Palestinian divide to say, yes, under those circumstances, violence is totally off the table. We go ahead with building our Palestinian state. We have outstanding claims. The Israeli side would have outstanding claims as well. If you acknowledge that the Palestinians are not going to be able to provide anything close to 100% security, external actors will get you closer to 100%, but no one's going to get you quite there. And That's the level of risk that everyone in the world has to live with, including Israelis. If the Arab states can get on board and say, that's enough to trigger this much of the Arab Peace Initiative, we recognize the border a significant degree, if not full diplomatic relations with Israel, really very significantly moving that ball forward, then I'm not saying that's a simple deliverable, but I think that's the kind of deliverable one might be trying to drive towards, including substituting Palestinian capacity
right.
where it doesn't exist and where it's not going to exist,
right.
as long as the defining reality there is an occupation reality.
Right.
Now, you rightly point out that anyone making that decision on the American side to push for that option would need to have a degree of confidence that you're not going to be left with egg on your face, and one could only supply a degree of confidence. I think it's better than the alternatives. I acknowledge it's not 100%. I'm not sure what the better option is, because Tom Friedman and others, who I'm sure we've both read, said, well, give them the phone number, walk away. Walking away from this means saying America is no longer Israel's facilitator-in-chief. And I don't think that's going to happen, and I personally wouldn't particularly like it.
Right. I mean, walking away is not an option, disengagement. Maybe I'm too much a prisoner of the past. And I think that to some degree is true, but, I am a student of history, and history teaches the great power to avoid two things: omniscience, the fact that they know everything, and omnipotence, the fact that they can do everything. The only precedents we have for Arab-Israeli peacemaking were oriented around two fundamental principles. Number one, both sides got 100% of what they wanted, in the case of Egypt and Israel, 100%. And number two, it was a deal done between states, who had the power, the authority, the legitimacy, not democratic polities, to be sure, in either the Jordanian or the Egyptian case. Centralized authoritarian societies that had the capacity to take all the guns away and to impose order and control, and to give the Israelis, let's face it, what it is, the only thing they get out of this, which is peace and quiet. Forget regional integration. The Israeli markets are in Europe, America, and Asia. And the bloom is off the rose, it seems to me, even on the benefits of peace after watching the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty and the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty.
Exactly. Take that off the menu.
Right. So all I'm suggesting is that what the Obama administration is hoping to do is fundamentally unprecedented. And my only cautionary note to this potentially transformative president is be very careful that you don't conflate and confuse your victory here at home, which is quite provocative, quite controversial. And even though I believe it's a moral responsibility for every American to have health care, has stressed the system in a way that defies previous transformational change when there were bipartisan majorities and the country in the 30s and the 60s, however crisis-oriented and turbulent it was ready. Don't think that the Arab-Israeli conflict is the same as having a slender majority in Congress. It's not. The moving parts are many. The chances of failure, very, very high. Be careful, be smart, and who knows, maybe over time you can get an agreement on borders that could lead to much bigger and bolder things. I quite agree with you. I think it's certainly a chance worth taking.
I'll take that, grab it, and I guess add one thing, which is Secretary Clinton, who I think made a remarkable speech at the APAC policy conference just this week, both reaffirming the relationship and the commitment, but also speaking some home truths. She said the urgency for Israel was demography, which we're all very aware of, ideology, which is the prolongation of this conflict only strengthens radicalism, which I think she was right, although I don't think the nuance in terms of who are the radicals is drilled down enough or is distinguished enough. And technology, in arguing that even with American support, Israel won't always be able to assume total technological superiority. But the other thing that happened, which I don't want to be convinced that it will tip the balance, but people started paying attention to what the military are saying. I think what people heard General Petraeus a couple of weeks ago testifying and made a big deal of that testimony. Actually, it was nothing new. Ever since 9/11 and ever since the Iraq War, all the people who have headed CENTCOM have said more or less exactly the same thing. And General Petraeus said almost verbatim the same thing a year ago. But people have started paying attention and noticing that. And it's an American interest.
Yeah, it's an American interest, General, but I have to say that it's also a very oversimplified monocausal explanation. American lives.
I think people intentionally set up a straw man that says you do Israel-Palestine and the Middle East becomes an oasis and a loving
I think we know,
which is nonsense.
But if the implication is that American lives are threatened by an unresolved Palestinian conflict, I'm prepared to accept that argument. I am. If you add, at the same time, the following: American lives are threatened by our support for authoritarian Arab regimes. American lives are threatened by the fact that we now occupy 2 Muslim countries with thousands and thousands of American forces. The fact that who we are for a disturbingly large minority of Arabs and Muslims, our openness, our promiscuity, our tolerance, even our secularism, even though we are, by European standards, a very traditional country, all of those things threaten American lives as well. So to argue and to identify the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as the sole overriding reason that Americans are in harm's way is not only wrong, Daniel, it's potentially extremely dangerous.
I think no one is doing that.
Right.
No one is doing that except those who want to knock down a straw man.
Right.
And I think what people are saying is you have to address each of the relevant things that affect American national security. This is one of them. I don't agree with you that they hate. I think a tiny minority hate America for what America is. And that's the minority that you can isolate and marginalize if you address the other issues. Israel-Palestine is one of them. It happens to be a very iconoclastic one and one with a great staying power.
It is. There's no question. But not to mislead, it would be a fool's errand to argue that a resolution of this problem is going to fix a region that is angry, dysfunctional, broken, and I might add, I'm not talking only about Al-Qaeda and those groups who actually would commit acts of terror, who is powered fundamentally by a logic which at times, frankly, is not only incomprehensible with respect to what they blame us for. We're blamed for everything, including, I might add, if they're not blaming us, then they're blaming Mossad for 9/11. This is a region this is a region that has to grow up in many respects, Daniel, no matter how ancient its character. It's the only region in the world that doesn't have the kind of functioning democratic polities that now appear in every other region of the world. So I just don't want us to oversimplify and lead the listeners to the conclusion that Palestine is the key to everything.
And then maybe, if you want to make some,
I think we should
closing comment. I think it would be an equally foolish thing, and I think you're saying this as well, to pretend this doesn't have an impact and that America is not looked at in significant ways through the lens, through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I totally agree with you in terms of the relationship with these anachronistic, undemocratic, authoritarian regimes. For me, part of that relates back to Israel-Palestine, because actually the more democratic the Arab world would be, the more of a problem you'd have with it if you haven't resolved Israel-Palestine at the same time. And I think that was one of the big mistakes of neoconservatism in that respect, not understanding and appreciating that link. But my closing pitch on the issue we've mainly been discussing is perhaps to take from something that you said, which is I don't see those same warm kind of, yay, we've made peace, pop the champagne bottle agreements that happened in the past and perhaps we could have envisaged on the Israeli-Palestinian front. And I think we need a new language, and it's probably not a peacemaking language. It's probably much more about creating a new deoccupation equilibrium. That's the thing that I think is possible, by no means easy, but I think a new deoccupation equilibrium, not as a solo American effort, but it will need American leadership. And I think there's an Israeli and a Palestinian side there to go for that. I think it's worth going for.
It's certainly worth testing, and I would simply recast your language slightly.
Please do.
We're looking for political accords that end conflict and create the basis which over time and through generations might bring Arabs and Israelis a measure of a functioning normality. That's what I think we want. The word peace has been emptied of all meaningful content. The Arabs and Israelis have never had it. They don't have it now. And the way people use the word, they're not going to have it for a very long time. But I like your formulation, your objective. Let's go for it. It's certainly better than the alternative. Daniel, it's been a pleasure.
Great talking to you.
And be in touch. Goodbye, blogging head world. Take care.
Goodbye, blogging head
Bye-bye.
world. Bye.